Let's talk about building good mana bases, because I see a lot of bad ones, and I think our commander decks deserve better. I'm going to give you my approach and tips so that you can build perfect mana bases 60% of the time, every time. The more colors we add, the harder it is to build the mana base. So, because I like to make life hard for myself, I'm going to attempt to make a good 5 color budget mana base for a budget oriented Ur-Dragon build I'm doing, and I'll use that as a vehicle to share my thoughts on building mana bases. Stick around to see how that turns out. So, mana bases don't just make themselves bad, and I doubt that you're actively trying to wreck your deck. There are some underlying reasons where things go wrong. Let's start there. With the first problem, money. Good lands are expensive, and to get a good mana base when building or upgrading a new deck, our choices are usually to spend a lot on expensive lands or proxy. Both of those are fine, but many people, maybe you, want to play with real cards and don't want to skip dinner for a week because they need to buy a new set of shock lands. If we don't do that, we're probably stuck with a bunch of lands that come into play tapped to provide color fixing and flexibility. If you've got any precons that are 3 or more colors, you know this pain all too well. Or we play basics and do a prayer at the start of every game that we don't get mana screwed. If we somehow avoid all of that, but we need lots of colors, we tend to fall into the trap of relying solely on mana crutches. Fickle cards like Mana Rocks or the World Tree, perhaps Dryad of Elysian Grove, all of which can be great, but if removed, completely cripple us. While this all probably looks a little bit doomed, there is some hope, much like I hope that you'll like this video. But we actually have to put some thought into it if we're going to solve this mana base problem. In fact, I think most of our commander problems arise simply because we don't think enough, because we're on autopilot half the time and don't have the awareness or knowledge to take control. And grabbing the controls is the first step to solving things. In this case, landing this plane in Mana Paradise. And what I mean by taking control is challenging and questioning your decisions and choices. This means not simply adding the same lands to each deck, or just using what's on EDHREC for the commander color pairing. As an example of choices, common mistakes that I see are lots of tapped lands that ruin mana curves, or a bunch of non-basic utility lands that wreck our ability to play spells because of an unlikely potential upside that's rarely worth the trade-off. Through this process, you may realize that you've been making almost no choices or decisions whilst on autopilot at all. And looking at your deck and thinking about what it needs suddenly creates a ton of choices for you. Speaking of our decks, to know you've got the right mana, you need to know what you're trying to play. And for that, we need to look at our deck and the cards in it. What are the color pips, and how many of those pips are there? And at what mana cost? This will tell us how early in the game we need access to certain mana combinations, and how many sources we need to make that amount of mana. It'll also tell us what we can get away with. For example, if your deck has a low curve with tons of 1 to 3 drops, then that should limit how many tap lands you have on your deck. But if our deck has very few turn 1 plays, it frees us up to add a few more. As important as lands are the other sources of mana in our decks. Ramp, Mana Rocks, and even card draw are all ways to provide additional mana, and including the right support pieces is critical to guaranteeing that you can play what you want, when you want. I typically aim for about 44 to 45 mana sources in the average deck. But while that's the average, don't let it become a new autopilot, because in some decks you want to break that rule. Lastly, know what your budget is, or at least know whether or not money will limit you or not. In this instance, I'm trying to make this Ur-Dragon budget build as cheap as possible, so I know that from the start, shocks, triumphs, and fetches aren't really an option, and I need to find cheaper ways of finding a playable mana base. So, what are my options? And how do I put this into practice while building my deck? Let's take a look, starting with the cards I want to play, and specifically the color pips. The colors are fairly spread, and it's clear to me that I have absolutely no room to be greedy by trying to fit any utility into this mana base. I need almost equal access to most colors, with the exception of green that I need the most access to, but that's largely because of my ramp, which we'll get to in a bit. Next, mana curve. I have no 1-drops, so immediately I know that I have room for some tap lands, because my first turn is dead anyway. Beyond that, the bulk of my game starts at 5 mana, reduced to 4 by the Ur-Dragon, so the early game and turns 2 to 3 are all about setup for me for turn 4 and beyond. If we look at my 2-drops, I have some Mana Rocks and some ramp, but the rest of these spells are really for use in the later game. On turn 2, I generally want to be ramping, and on turn 3, I either want to cast a 4-cost spell, which will most likely be ramp, or play a 3-cost spell and give myself some room to play another tap land without creating pain in my mana curve. On turn 4, I ideally want access to 5 mana with a source of mana of every color, so I can start churning out dragons, some of which need all the colors. So that's the cards I want to play. But what about the lands? The lands I chose give me the best chance to get these spicy dragons out reliably. Before I get into it, I'm going to call out that I tested my final mana base 100 times to ensure it worked, and I'll share those results in a minute. So stick with me. When building the mana base, I looked at every available option, and for a while I really wanted to try to make the new budget triomes work. The problem with them was that they were effectively a tap land most of the time, and only fetched basics, and I found that I hardly ever used their colorless mana ability. So, what did make the cut? First up is Pain Lands. To me, they are easily some of the most underrated lands in Commander. They give 2 colors, with negligible life loss, and they're very cheap. An absolute no-brainer. Speaking of no-brainers, are Command Tower and Exotic Orchard that do something very similar for us. Next up, we have the Tricolor Tap Lands. Whilst I hate lands that are forced to come into play tapped, based on my mana curve, I know I have the luxury of giving these some space in the deck, and I've included all these triomes that give me green mana. I've then included some searchable tap duels, at least those that give me forests, so that I can search for them. The fact that they come into play tapped is pretty minor, because I'm not going to be casting anything else on the turn that I use a 3 visits or a Sky Shroud Claim to search for them. I've then also got one of each basic. And last, but definitely not least, are the check lands. On turn 1, these can often be played as tapped lands, but outside of that, the goal is that they come into play untapped, and in my experience, they do. Given the prevalence of the check lands, it's clear I'm relying heavily on searching up key lands, and that my ramp choices focus on using turns 1 to 3 as a setup period. I want to be playing Farseek, Nature's Law, and 3 visits on turn 2, and Hunting Wilds, Ranger's Path, Sky Shroud Claim, or Temp with Discovery on turn 3. To support these latter 4-cost spells, I also have a group of mana rocks that make green mana, but the goal of these is to enable the ramp spells, after which they aren't really that critical. Now, I imagine you're thinking that that's a hell of a lot of tap lands, but bear with me. Here's how my testing went. I played 100 games in total, developing the mana base as I played the games, and the second 50 of my test games I played with this exact mana base. Across those 50 test games, 90% of the time, I had all the colors and mana that I needed to play the spells in my hand on turn 4. This to me was a big win, but I wanted to make sure that I wasn't mulliganing excessively to get those results. Turns out, I mulliganed about 10% of the time across those 50 games. And what about the elephant in the room? The tap lands. Tap lands made my flow clunky in about 10% of the games, with 90% of the games feeling no effects of the tap lands at all. And based on this, I'd call this mission a success, as the mana base does what I want much closer to every time than 60% of the time. It's a mana base that on paper looks a bit janky, but in practice works really well because of how it engages with the cards in my deck and the mana curve that I'm aiming to hit. This mana base definitely won't work in every deck, but that's kind of the point, because a mana base, much like the cards that make up the rest of the deck, should be bespoke for each deck and not copied and pasted across without thought. Hopefully the key message here resonates and is helpful, which is not to be on autopilot and to ask better questions of the cards you're adding to your decks. In this case, the mana base. The final result for me is a mana base that costs 80% less than the actual mana base in my expensive Ur-Dragon deck. And given the cards are largely very similar, with the exception of a few expensive dragons, it should really have me questioning why I spent $500 on the original mana base to begin with. But that's a whole separate video. Hopefully you found this useful, and thanks for watching. If you want to talk about this, find me in the comments or in the base deck department Discord.